Kristen, thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea. You're in Washington. It's really good to have you on the podcast. Now, you have a strict policy, I'm told, of never predicting who is going to win any presidential election. I just wondered why that was.
I've learned my lesson from 2016, but also I frankly think at this point it would be almost professional malpractice to do so, given that the polls here in the US are so close and the potential for polling error in either direction means that you should not feel confident that you know what will happen.
2016, obviously, the polls very much suggested that Hillary Clinton was going to win not only the popular vote, but the Electoral College. Why do you think they got that wrong? Lessons learned from that?
So, over the last three presidential elections, whenever polls have got it wrong, it is because they are underestimating unlikely voters. So, in 2012, the polls underestimated Barack Obama, they overestimated Mitt Romney. And in that year, the unlikely voters were the type of folks that were going for the Democratic candidate. But since Donald Trump has come on the scene, unlikely voters have been slightly more favorable to Republicans. And so if pollsters misjudge who will and won't participate in an election, that's the big way that you wind up missing what the result ultimately is. In the 2022 midterms, I would add, the polling error was relatively small, but it went in the opposite direction. And that's because in that midterm, the unlikely voters were younger, female, and they tended to turn out for Democrats. And midterm elections usually have much lower turnout. So it's a little bit more of a guessing game for pollsters. But that's why I hold out the possibility that this election could be less close than the polls make it seem. But we don't actually know which direction it will break in because there is precedent within the last 4 years of notable polling error in both directions.
Kristen, most of the big final polls that we've seen coming out just in the last sort of 24 hours have Trump and Harris completely neck and neck. But under the surface, you think that those polls are not all telling the same story. So can you just talk us through these two competing theories of reboot versus realignment?
You're right. So there are a number of polls that I've been laughing every time a new poll comes out and it says, the race is 48-48. It's like that is exactly what the last three polls have all told us. But if you look into the crosstabs, which is how pollsters report out the different demographic groups, there are some polls that are showing a real realignment happening in our politics. They are showing that younger voters are swinging more to the right as older voters are swinging more toward the center. So the generation gap is smaller. They're also showing the gap between, say, white voters and voters of color shrinking a little bit as Donald Trump does better among, say, Latino voters, Black men, and as Kamala Harris and the Democrats do better among more sort of upscale, more highly educated white voters. But there are other polls that don't show that realignment happening as dramatically. Instead, they show what I've called a reboot, which is essentially that we are going back to the fault lines of the Obama-Romney contest in 2012, where you have Democrats really doing well with young voters, really doing quite well with voters of color, while Republicans overperform with groups like senior citizens and even with white college-educated voters. And so at this point, I lean more toward thinking we will have a realignment. I do think that Republicans are going to make some gains among at least younger men. I do think that they're likely to make gains among Latino and Black men. I think we're going to see a very large gender gap, but whether it will be larger on the male or female side will, I think, make a big determinant, be a big determinant of who wins the election.
Why do you think that Trump has been so successful with demographics who you might instinctively not imagine he would be that attractive to, like young Black men, Hispanic voters? There have been all sorts of allegations around, racism and the way he argues and the way he talks. But there is something about the message he sends or the way he acts that is attractive to, I suppose, Kristen, these might be called in this election the unlikely voters.
There's something that is important to remember whenever we're trying to analyze why Donald Trump appeals to voters, and that is to remember that he is unlike any other political figure in America today, and it's hard to think of many analogs across American history. And that's in part because before he ever became a presidential candidate, he had decades of being well known by the American public and, frankly, around the world as someone who was wealthy. He was a businessman. He was always known as having controversy swirling around him. And so there's an extent to which some of this is just priced into the way people think about him and the sorts of things that no other politician would ever be able to say and get away with. Donald Trump simply has a different set of rules that seem to apply to him. And this really frustrates Democrats, of course. They say, well, Kamala Harris is being held to a double standard. If she even thought some of the things that Donald Trump says proudly and prominently in public, she would get laughed out of national politics. And yet it's important to remember that Donald Trump is just different. He is so well known. His brand as a celebrity businessman remains a key piece of what voters think about him, and especially for voters who are, say, men who have been finding themselves with even more challenges as the global economy changes, and as Mr. Tough Guy, Mr. Businessman has something to offer them that they're not finding anywhere else.
Do you think that it's difficult to poll Trump supporters? Kamala and I were talking about this earlier, that a lot of people lie when they're surveyed. And our assumption when we were talking about this was that perhaps people are more likely to lie if they're going to vote Trump, and they may tell people they're going to vote for Harris. Is that something that makes it much harder to get an accurate poll?
So I feel relatively confident that we are capturing a lot of Trump voters in our polls. And part of that is because many pollsters in the US this time around are doing something that the technical word for it is weighting to recalled vote. But in layman's terms, it just means we're making sure that we have an adequate number of people who say they voted for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. So even if there are some people who are a little bit shy, we are still weighting the results of our poll to show an appropriate sample of people who like Donald Trump and are unafraid to say that they like Donald Trump. Now, the challenge is this is a little bit like using an experimental drug to treat a disease. The disease being polling error. We don't want to have polling error. We don't want to miss Trump voters. But the idea of weighting your results to a past election, it's an experimental drug. We don't yet know what the side effects are. And it could mean that by trying so hard to make sure we're hearing from those Trump voters, are we missing something else that's causing the potential for polling error? And that's why I think there is still a chance that if the polls are off, we don't necessarily know in which direction that will be.
Does it suggest to you that there could be another outcome on election day, which, with only a relatively small move in how people vote, there could actually be a landslide on either side, or someone could win big? This idea of it being very, very tight, and there'll be all these legal challenges, and it will be an absolute bun fight, as we'd say here in the UK, may not be true, and it could be someone might win big.
It absolutely could. And that's why my message to everyone is, because the polls are so close, that doesn't necessarily mean the election will be close. It means the range of possible outcomes is very wide. It means that we could have anything from a Trump landslide to a Harris landslide. Those are all within the margin of error of what we're seeing in the polling averages. Because remember, because of our strange electoral college system, even if Harris wins the battleground states by 1 or 2 points, not by very much, she would still amass a very large number of electoral votes because they're handed out in this winner-take-all fashion by states. So you could still have a national race that is very close, even as one of the candidates runs away with a lot of votes in the electoral college.
We've noticed here that the Trump campaign is putting an awful lot of money, millions of dollars, I think, into adverts highlighting Kamala Harris's position on trans issues. I think there's one advert that says, "Crazy liberal Kamala is for they, them. President Trump is for you." Is that an issue that perhaps could be a factor in this election, and is that something which is quite difficult to factor into polling?
One of the things that campaigns are always trying to do is find issues that unite their own party and are issues that win over a significant majority of the political center. Anything that makes independent and swing voters agree with your base is an issue that tends to be one you want to talk about a lot. And the Trump campaign has obviously calculated that the issue of transgender rights, and particularly how that plays out with things like schools or prisons, that's one where your average American voter is a little bit skeptical of where the left has pushed the issue and agrees more with the Republican position. Meanwhile, for the Republican base, this is a very animating issue. They think of it as symbolic of the excesses of the Democratic Party, sort of agreeing with their very, very progressive left. And so they view this as an issue where their most ardent base actually agrees with swing voters. And that's not always the case. There are plenty of areas. I mean, take the issue of abortion, for instance, which is one the Harris campaign talks a lot about. That's the opposite for Republicans. That's an issue where even within the Republican Party, there is division. And certainly the far right of the GOP and your centrist swing voter, they are not seeing eye to eye on the issue of abortion right now. And so Democrats are using that in their ads because that unifies their side and splits the other. It's the same thing with the transgender rights issue and the Republican Party these days.
When Kamala Harris took over the nomination, there was quite a few people made the judgment that she could well now run away with it, that this would be the momentum moment, that Trump would suddenly seem like the older candidate, the old generation, the less capable candidate. And that hasn't actually come to pass. There was a bit of momentum for Kamala Harris in the first few weeks of her campaign to be the actual president. What is it about Trump that has been able to maintain his position of popularity with so many millions of Americans, even with the change of candidate on the Democrat side to a candidate who many Democrat voters and general voters think is a much stronger candidate than Joe Biden?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Democrats were wise to switch Joe Biden off of the ticket and to put somebody new in his place. I think after that disastrous debate performance against Donald Trump earlier in the summer, it was clear that Democrats needed a change. And voters are telling pollsters that they want a change. If we look around the world, incumbents are falling to challengers in election after election. And so being the incumbent in this election is a problem for anyone here in the United States. It's why Republicans feel very optimistic about the ability to pick up seats in the U.S. Senate. And it's why Republicans felt pretty good about the ability to beat Joe Biden. What Kamala Harris has been trying to do is shed the image that she would be a continuation of Joe Biden. She doesn't want voters to think of her as the incumbent. That's why I've been a little bit surprised that she didn't have a better answer to the question of what she would do differently than Joe Biden when she was asked. But I do think that in the end, for any voter that is undecided, they don't like the options in front of them, they are ultimately looking for change, and they're going to calculate who's most likely to bring me the change I'm looking for. The other thing Donald Trump has benefited from is that he is experiencing the benefits of nostalgia, meaning that when he was ending his presidency, if you asked people, do you approve or disapprove of the job Donald Trump is doing as president? His numbers were not good. That's why he didn't win the last election. But if you ask people today, did you approve of the job Donald Trump did as president? They will remember approving of how Trump was as president. They will remember, hey, prices were low, the world felt more at peace. And it is that fond memory of a Trump presidency that wasn't what they were feeling in the moment, but now with 4 years of distance, they do feel more fondly about the time he was in power. That's what's enabling him to reconsolidate some of the voters who may have left him in the 2020 election.
Can I just ask you, Kristen, you're something of an expert on millennials. We quite often talk here about how people of that age never pick their phone up, never use their phone, even though they have a phone in their hand all the time. Obviously, polling often relies on phone surveys. So how do you get to millennials if they are not used to picking up their phone, if they screen calls, don't answer unfamiliar numbers? How do you get to them?
So you're completely right. Every time technology makes it easier for me as a pollster to contact someone, that same technology makes it easier for them to evade me and avoid me. And we find that with younger voters as well. However, the thing that's great is that polling for politics is built on much of the same technology that is used for market research, corporations that are testing for their brand, trying to figure out what their new products should be. And there's a lot of investment into making online research very high quality. Most of the election polls that you see here in the US that are public are in some way, shape, or form either a mixed method where some of the contacts are done on the phone and some are done online. Many that I do at my firm, they're all done online. And they're using the same sorts of panels that market researchers are using for corporate and brand projects all the time. So we know that there is a low response rate these days. We know people don't want to take surveys. Oh my goodness, if you are a voter in a battleground state right now, I'm sure you're not picking up your phone for any unknown number because you're constantly getting get out the vote calls and poll calls. But nevertheless, we think that online polling here in the US has a lot of potential to get better and better, even as phone polling gets more challenging.
When you look at the key issues, immigration and the economy are often some of the top issues of concern for voters. You've already noted Kamala Harris's slightly surprising answer if you're the change candidate to what would you do differently from Joe Biden, and she didn't seem to have an answer for that, and also appeared to actually say nothing. Well, actually said nothing when first asked it. She did slightly change that answer when she was asked it a second time in a different interview. Could Kamala Harris have done a lot better on these key issues of economics or the economy and immigration? Has she misstepped there as well as on that issue of you shouldn't sound like the continuity candidate?
She has closed the gap a little bit with Donald Trump on the question of who do you trust more to handle the economy. And I think part of that is she has been talking in a more economically populist fashion, talking about how he would cut taxes for billionaires. That's the sort of thing that we know is very unpopular with voters, and particularly with the kinds of more populist voters Donald Trump has brought to the Republican coalition. So she has actually made some inroads on the issue of the economy, but it may not be enough. She still does trail significantly on the issue of immigration. The one issue where she does consistently have an advantage is that issue of abortion. But the final wildcard issue in this election, I think, will be foreign policy. Because on the one hand, you have an awful lot of voters, particularly young men here in the US, who have a more isolationist view. They have not grown up in an era where they think the US meddling throughout the world does us any good. They want to have things focused at home. And that is a message that Donald Trump has been carrying pretty consistently. But at the same time, you also have Kamala Harris, who's trying to make the case that actually Donald Trump is too unstable and erratic. And if we want a more peaceful world, we cannot possibly put him back in charge. So that's an issue that I think doesn't get a ton of attention, but is still weighing on voters' minds. Which of these candidates do I think has the temperament and judgment to create a more peaceful world? And that's one where I think the fight is still very much on.
Is anything in the polling telling you which of those two people, those undeciders, if there are still such a thing in America, are leaning? Is anyone winning that battle on who would be best in that foreign policy area?
Well, when it comes to undecided voters, I think it's valuable to think of them in two different categories. I think there are some voters who are undecided because they are overthinking the question, if this makes sense. They are thinking about this a lot. They really don't like Donald Trump and they worry about the effect he will have on our future. But they also worry that Kamala Harris is too progressive, too untested, may not be capable of doing the job well. And so they feel very torn and they agonize over this decision because they don't like either choice. I had a focus group participant a few weeks ago who said she thinks she'll probably end up voting for Harris, but she won't like it and she'll need to go drink some wine afterwards. But on the other hand, you have voters who are underthinking it. They are people who do not watch very much political news. They are trying to avoid this, pay no attention. And I had someone in a focus group describe them as a cat chasing a laser pointer, that they aren't thinking about it too much and how they feel is based on whatever they last saw in their social media feeds. And those voters, I can see them breaking a little bit more for Trump at the end, if only because I think he is still viewed as the change candidate. And if you are undecided going for the challenger, which in this case may be someone who is already an incumbent president, is typically how you would expect them to go.
You mentioned people who can't quite bring themselves to vote for Trump. Kamala and I noticed yesterday that Arnold Schwarzenegger had come out and said he wasn't going to vote for Trump. Obviously, he was a Republican governor of California. Do you think that those people who are unable to vote for Trump are more likely to vote for Kamala Harris, or do you think they're more likely just to not vote at all, and could that be what decides the election?
So I will say, I think a lot of the folks who are these, we've been calling them sort of the Nikki Haley Republicans as
Yeah.
a shorthand, which would be, somebody who leans to the right, but just simply cannot fathom voting for Donald Trump after all they have seen. The reality is that's a relatively small portion of the truly Republican electorate. When I take a look at swing state polls and I look at people who think of themselves as Republican or Republican leaning, it's usually only about 5% at most who are breaking away from Trump and saying they'll vote for Harris. And there is a similar amount of breakaway amongst Democrats who say that they're instead going to vote for Trump. So it does wind up evening out. I do wonder if instead it is among independents where you would see sort of ex-Republicans who don't even think of themselves as leaning that way. To what extent are they a factor? And I just think that with Harris, her attempts to try to win them over by saying, no, I promise you, I'm actually more moderate than you think. I'm not persuaded yet that they have been received as credible. In my Michigan focus group of voters, when I asked a lot of them to give me a word to describe Kamala Harris, many of them said deceptive, that they felt she was a little bit phony. They didn't feel like they had a good sense of who in her core she really was. And so if you are a Republican and you are hoping that she'll govern in a more moderate fashion, she has tried to say all the right things out on the campaign trail. I want to have Republicans in my cabinet. I want to have Republicans at the table. She's tried to change her positions on a number of issues, but I still don't think she's explained what her core values and principles are. She's given a laundry list of policy proposals, but I still think that she feels a bit unknown to some of those, the overthinker undecideds that I was talking about earlier, which is why she may ultimately get them to leave the ballot blank, but may struggle to actively get them to vote for her.
But the voters the voters there are seeing something that is maybe genuine, which is that she used to have a much more what might be described as progressive position on many issues, and she certainly appears to have suddenly discovered a more centrist instinct over the past few weeks, and a lot of voters will be looking at that, as you suggest, rather skeptically and
Yes.
thinking, well, we've had a very similar issue here, Kristen, with someone who's now our Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, being very much on the harder left of the Labour Party, and then suddenly discovering that he wanted to be a centrist, and it led to a lot of skepticism about him. And some of that skepticism has proved to be correct. We've just had a budget here. So the criticism of Kamala Harris is quite fair, isn't it, for voters to think this is a bit suspicious?
Yes, and I think she could have answered some of these questions about her conversion with a little bit more substance, and that might have set some concerns at ease. Let's take, for instance, the issue of fracking. That's a thing that she in 2019 said that she opposed. She wanted to see the reduction of the use of fossil fuels. And now she says she supports fracking because it's a major piece of the Pennsylvania economy. Pennsylvania, obviously a key swing state. And when she's asked, well, why did you change your position? Her answer is always very, it's political rhetoric. My values haven't changed, but the situation has changed. But she never really explains, here's what I used to believe and here's why it's changed. Here's what my principles are. Here's what I think the role of government is. Here's what I think America's role in the world ought to be. We still don't really have answers to those questions. We just know that she has conveniently decided to say she is more open to Republican ideas. And I think some voters already skeptical that politicians are being candid with them at all don't look at her as being particularly forthright on those issues.
Can I ask, Kristen, one of the things that struck us over here was that when Kamala Harris decided to go on Fox News, obviously very right-wing, Trump-supporting channel, She appeared to spend pretty much the entire interview just telling everybody how awful Trump was, which felt like a very odd thing for her to do. Presumably, though, that was a tactic. There's no way that she went on there and just decided that in the moment. Why do you think she did that?
I mean, I think that her decision to go on Fox News in and of itself was so interesting because, I mean, she really wanted to be able to, I think, get a double whammy. I think she wanted to be able to prove to Fox News viewers that she was not afraid, that she was tough enough to go into the arena. But I think it was also a way to rally her own base. Not that her base is people who watch Fox News, but people always like it when people on their side go into the lion's den and fight some battles. And certainly her exchanges with Bret Baier were at times a little testy. I think the intent of that was not just to try to persuade Fox News viewers, but to show her own base that she was tough and able to go out there into unfriendly territory.
So it was to motivate almost turnout on her side rather than to try and persuade any Fox News viewers that they should vote for her.
I think so. I also think that you should look at anything the campaigns are doing over the next couple of days as mostly about turnout rather than persuasion. We've already had almost, I believe, 60 million ballots cast here in the US. My firm is projecting that we will ultimately get to about 153, 154 million. We think turnout will be slightly down from 4 years ago, but nevertheless still pretty high by American historical standards. And so right now, because early voting is in full swing, ballots already being cast, when you see people taking actions, going out, doing rallies, these are mostly at this point focused on turning out and exciting your base, because the assumption, not incorrectly, is that people have generally made up their minds.
Beyond foreign policy, which you've touched on, are there other reasons why young men, or certain parts of the young male demographic, are leaning towards Trump?
So you've certainly had a bit of backlash, it feels like, to the quote unquote woke movement over the last few years here in the US. There has been a big push, and it has not just extended from politics, but it's popped up in education, it's popped up in corporate America. This push, which in many cases is very justifiable and good, to say we need to elevate women, we need to protect women, to elevate more diverse voices. But there is an extent to which I think particularly young white men in America may be feeling like, hey, I don't feel like I have much opportunity right now either. But nobody seems to want to listen to me because everybody says, well, you have privilege, you're fine, I'm not worried about you. And Donald Trump is very effective at telling voter groups who feel very disenfranchised, very disaffected, like nobody is listening to them. He goes to those voters and he says, I am listening to you and I do care about you. That's frankly why this whole controversy over the last week of Joe Biden saying, or at least being interpreted as having said that he thinks Trump supporters are quote unquote garbage. The reason why that's such a controversy is because there are lots of voters out there that think politicians are just hostile to them, don't like them, don't respect them, and don't care. And Donald Trump has always made it a point to go to voters that he thinks aren't being paid attention to by the establishment. Says, no, I see you, I care. And that's why he has been showing up on all sorts of podcasts that politicians never would have gone on before. He goes on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is very targeted at this kind of male voter who may not normally have been reached by traditional political media. He just got endorsed this week by Jake Paul, who's a very sort of prominent influencer, wrestler, MMA fighter. He's really been leaning into this kind of toughness, masculinity argument, as well as speaking to young men's disenfranchisement culturally. So I think foreign policy is a piece of it, but there's also questions of cultural norms that have shifted and a bit of a backlash against that in some ways, as well as real concerns about economic opportunity and mobility that young men in America are feeling.
You mentioned disenfranchisement, and we've already talked a lot over here, and never mind where you are, about the idea of what might happen if, say, Trump loses the election but maybe wins the popular vote, that stolen election narrative. How worried are people over there about the possibility that we could see violence if that were to be the case?
Well, I think there's a lot of concern that I have about the next week or two in America because temperature is very high here in terms of the emotional state of the country. And that's partially because, if you asked voters back in the 1980s, does who wins the election have an effect on your life? Most Americans wouldn't really say yes to that question. It mattered, but it wasn't something that they were going to be thinking about day in and day out. It feels to voters in this election like the stakes are unbelievably high. Like this is a fight for survival of the country. People are always saying this is the most important election of your lifetime. But I think this time voters actually believe it. They really believe this is one of the most important elections they'll ever participate in. And both sides, voters think that they must win in order to save the country from complete destruction, not from going off on the wrong track, not from having some policies that might be bad, from the destruction of the country. And so with temperature that high, with the stakes feeling that high, you can have a lot of really bad decisions getting made by people who get caught up in feeling frustrated if they think their own side is losing. So I very much worry about this. One of the most troubling things that's happened here in the US over the last week was the burning of a ballot box out on the West Coast, I believe allegedly by a protester regarding the Gaza issue. So it wasn't necessarily a Trump supporter trying to burn Democratic ballots or a Democratic supporter trying to burn Republican ballots. But it's the sort of thing where if enough of those incidents happen, it will undercut the credibility of the election and make it so that this could be, if we thought things were contentious last time and you remember January 6th, we're hoping that we can prevent that this time by knowing the possibility is there and trying to do everything possible to avoid it. But the temperature is just so high that I do worry that we may be seeing a very turbulent few weeks.
Kristen, that's been absolutely wonderful to spend a bit of time with you and your thoughts on the landscape in America. We do appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thank you so much for having me.